Hi everyone, we're back at it. Today's lesson is on nutrient deficiencies. We finally get to this topic. I know you guys want this for your projects, so let's get on with it. Um, Before we get too far, I want to go over some real basic stuff. You're going to be laughing at first, but trust me, this is something a lot of times you forget. Keep in mind that plants grow at the tip. Okay, that means that new cells, new growth happens at the tip. Okay, so new growth versus old growth. That means that as leaves are grown, the plant moves up, leaving them behind. So where they've been put in place, they are now considered old. And where new leaves are growing, they're considered new. Okay? Keep this in mind. So when we're talking about nutrients, for example, they come in the roots, right? They move up into the plant. They go to where there's the most activity, which is the apical meristem. That's where the plant is actively growing. That's where new materials being constructed, proteins, cell walls, DNA, all that stuff that the plant needs to grow. Those nutrients are then incorporated into the leaves and it continues to move forward, leaving those nutrients behind. So as far as mobile nutrients and immobile nutrients, nutrients that are left behind that are not mobile stay left behind, right? Where mobile nutrients can actually be removed from the leaf and reallocated to the growing tip that's advanced further ahead. So mobile nutrients are nutrients that can be extracted and recycled. Okay, so we've got immobile and we've got mobile. All right. So immobile nutrients, they're in the old leaves, and mobile nutrients, all in the new leaves. As far as deficiencies, right? So that means that immobile nutrients, we're looking for symptoms in the plant. So let's say there's not enough of a nutrient, and we're looking at where the deficiency is presenting. If the deficiency is at the top of the plant, that means that the roots are not supplying the nutrient. There's not enough of that nutrient in the root zone. And because it's immobile, the plant can't take it from old leaves and move it up. So the deficiency presents at the top of the plant. All right? So immobile nutrients present at the top. And mobile nutrients, that means that if the roots are not presenting enough of the nutrient, the plant can actually extract the nutrient from the leaf and move it to the tip, which means that the old leaf will now show the deficiency. Okay? So this is an important concept. Here's a list of mobile nutrients. So in plants, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, sulfur, molybdenum. Those are mobile. That means they can be removed from old leaves and reallocated, repurposed to new leaves. Immobile or non-mobile nutrients are iron, manganese, calcium, boron, copper, and zinc. I also need to go over some terminology here. When you're doing your nutrient deficiency projects, it's really important you use proper terminology, right? You're trying to become a professional horticulturalist, so you got to use the proper terminology. So instead of saying the leaf is yellowing, we're going to say the leaf is becoming chlorotic, or it's demonstrating chlorosis. Okay? That basically means that chlorophyll, here's a healthy leaf, chlorophyll is being degraded, and you're left with the non-green pigments in the leaf, so it looks yellow. Interveinal chlorosis. So it's chlorosis, but it's between the veins. You're all familiar with the vein structure of a leaf, right? There's the rib and the side branching. So some nutrients present as interveinal chlorosis. That means the yellowing is between the veins, right? That's between the veins. That's interveinal chlorosis. Necrosis or necrotic growth. This is dying brown, crispy edges of the leaves. Necrosis. Okay, that's the term we want to use. So let's get into it. Let's look at nitrogen deficiency. So nitrogen is a mobile element. It is important for the production of chlorophyll. There's actually 4 nitrogen atoms for every chlorophyll molecule. If you don't have enough nitrogen, you can't make chlorophyll. So that means your leaves are yellow. chlorosis. Typically, you get weak growth because you can't make any chlorophyll, you can't make sugars, it's very difficult to make proteins. Basically, everything grinds to a halt. It is in the lower leaves. Why? Because it is mobile, which means it can relocate. So typically plants will remove the nitrogen from the lower leaves and move it to the top of the plant where the growth is. By the way, nitrogen is probably the most common nutrient deficiency in houseplants. That's why the lower leaves get yellow and fall off, because you're not feeding your houseplant. You just give it city water every time, no food. And eventually it starts removing nutrients from the old leaves and moving them up to the new ones. And so they drop their old leaves. Possible causes, don't forget the obvious one. You may be deficient for nitrogen because you just don't have enough fertilizer. But another interesting one is that the soil might actually be too wet. So if you have really wet soil, you get bacteria that grow, and they actually will take the nitrogen and convert it into nitrogen gas. And so typically plants that are in really wet soil get yellow quickly because all the nitrogen in the soil is converted to nitrogen gas, which evaporates out of the soil into the atmosphere, and it's lost. Some more pictures of nitrogen deficiency. These are older leaves, so it's mobile, older leaves, and it's chlorosis. This is a ficus, so a common houseplant, or those trees you see in shopping malls, often dropping leaves. Corn, nitrogen deficiency. Let's look at phosphorus. Phosphorus is a mobile nutrient, and it causes purpling of leaves. I didn't have a fancy term for that. You can call it purpling if you want. Typically, it's what we call the production of a pigment called anthocyanin. So in this strawberry plant here, you'll see there's purple pigment at the edges of the leaves. And in this tomato, you can see underneath the leaves, there's purple coloration. That is classic phosphorus deficiency. Another thing that's really interesting about phosphorus is when you don't have enough, the plant is stunted. Often growers like to actually purposely hold back phosphorus when they're producing young plants because that keeps them compact. Another interesting fact about phosphorus is that when the soil is cold, plants have a difficult time accessing phosphorus, which is why plants often look purple when it's cold in the spring. Potassium is a mobile nutrient. It starts with yellowing on the margins of the leaves, like in this picture, and as it gets worse, the edges become necrotic. So there's that term, necrosis. Okay, so this is late, this is early stage deficiency. With tomato plants, you get curling at the tip as well of the leaf. Potassium is an interesting nutrient. It is used mostly for osmotic regulation, right? So the biggest job that potassium does is open and close stomata. So that's in order for the leaves to breathe. So if you start running out of potassium, you have a hard time getting your leaves to open and let gases in. And so the plants start to run out of sugar. Magnesium. Magnesium is a critical atom for chlorophyll. I already mentioned that there's 4 nitrogens. So typically the nitrogens form like a grid. And in the middle of those 4 nitrogens, there is a magnesium. And that's what does all the catalytic work. That magnesium is critical for splitting water to produce hydrogen and electrons. So if you start running out of magnesium, you're going to start getting reduction in chlorophyll. So you see the interveinal chlorosis that's happening on this leaf. That's classic magnesium deficiency. And it's mobile, so it is on the older leaves. Okay? Here's another picture of magnesium. You can see classic interveinal chlorosis. You can't see that this is older leaves because the picture is just showing one leaf, but it would be at the bottom of the plant. One of the quickest ways to solve magnesium deficiencies is to add Epsom salts to the plants, because that's basically magnesium sulfate, which will solve that problem fairly quickly. Here's magnesium deficiency in a tomato plant. Again, this would be old leaves that are having interveinal chlorosis. There's the picture I've been looking for. It's got the nitrogens. There's 3 and 4 with the magnesium suspended in the center. And that's where all the busy work happens in chlorophyll, the magic. And there's magnesium deficiency in peppers. Lots of examples of magnesium deficiency. Possibly because a lot of ready-made bagged fertilizers don't actually have a lot of calcium and magnesium in them. If you want a complete fertilizer, you need to buy something that will say, have 5 numbers on it. So NPK, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then the next 2 numbers would be calcium and magnesium. So sulfur deficiency is an interesting one. Technically, this is what we call partially mobile, and this is a nutrient that presents differently across different plant species. Up at the top is eggplant, down below is tomatoes, the next slide is petunias, all very different. Well, I guess the eggplants and petunias are similar. But partially mobile means that it kind of can reallocate old leaves to the new growth, but not always. But generally the entire plant has a lighter green color. Primarily because sulfur is used to make one particular amino acid which is needed to make all the proteins in the plant. So if you don't have enough sulfur, you're missing out on that one building block. And that means the plant can't make all the proteins that it actually needs. Petunias are a real classic example of a crop that's sulfur sensitive. If you see a stunted yellow petunia, you almost always have a sulfur deficiency. So on the left is healthy, on the right is sulfur deficient petunia. Molybdenum. This is a unique nutrient. It is partially mobile like sulfur. Really the only crop that I know of that we have troubles with molybdenum is poinsettias. And what you see is this sort of yellowing on the margins of the leaves. And it's usually older leaves, but if you look carefully, the new leaves have a bit of a yellower tinge as well. So it's partially mobile, but it is not a very common deficiency. Here's an interesting tip to help you remember which nutrients are mobile and which ones are not. All the micronutrients are, generally speaking, immobile. So iron, manganese, calcium, boron, copper, zinc, those are all immobile. They cannot be reallocated. So iron, which is the classic nutrient deficiency that often you come across, presents at the top of the plant because it's not mobile, right? The plant can't go down to the old leaves and pull out some nitrogen and move it up to the new growth because it's immobile. So it presents at the top new growth. So we get chlorosis, right? So yellowing or even bleaching, basically loss of chlorophyll in the top parts of the plant. Sometimes it's intraveinal chlorosis. Sometimes it's all the way across. Generally, you can still see the veins, but the veins are not as green as they would be for, say, like what magnesium looks like. But this is new growth, not old growth. pH is almost always the reason why you end up with iron deficiencies. If you look at this chart, if your pH gets too high, this actually, I think this is pH 7 here, and this is pH 5, something like that. So you're looking at, if your pH is too high, iron becomes less available and you get iron deficiency. So first thing you want to check is the pH in your soil. Manganese. So manganese looks similar to iron. It's non-mobile, which means new growth, but the veins are much more pronounced. So the intraveinal chlorosis is not as broad as it is with iron deficiency. So this is a tricky one to diagnose between different crops, but it is not as common as iron. So your first guess is going to be iron every time, and then you're going to, if you add iron or change the pH and it doesn't fix, then you know you've got a manganese problem. Calcium. This is another one that you will often come across. Calcium is immobile. Calcium is used to strengthen cell walls. So if you don't have enough calcium, your cell walls become weak. So in this picture here of the strawberry that's deficient for calcium, the tip of the leaf cannot handle the expansion, and so it cracks and splits and starts to die back. That's typical for calcium. And with tomatoes, if you don't have enough calcium, the ovaries don't form properly, and then as the tomato matures, the the tip of the ovary, which is furthest from the vasculature, starts to die from weak cell walls, and you get this black spot at the bottom of your tomatoes. That's telling you that you do not have enough calcium in your root zone. We call that blossom end rot. Remember that one, because I always like to ask that question on the final exam. So leaf tip burn and blossom end rot. It is a critical nutrient for cell walls. One of the reasons why it says here that you need good airflow is because calcium in and of itself is actually a very large atom, and to try to get it from the roots up into the plant means you need to have water moving through the plant rapidly to pull it all the way to the edge. It comes up the vasculature and works its way through the veins of the leaf and has to get to the edge of the leaf that's growing, right? That takes a lot of water movement to pull it through. So typically we see calcium deficiency problems when our growing environment is too humid because we're not getting enough water flowing up to the plant. So it's important to have good airflow and not have high humidity if you're trying to avoid calcium deficiencies. The classic example is lettuce. This kind of edge burn you see here is from too much humidity and not enough airflow. And lettuce is particularly susceptible because if you think about it, a head of lettuce is a dense ball of leaves. They're not open like a bush, which means it's very difficult to get air to flow between the leaves, which means you're not going to have that moisture being pulled up through those leaves. So it's usually important to oversupply calcium for lettuce just to make sure you don't get that tip burn. Or grow varieties that are more open to let air into the head. Boron. This is an interesting one. Boron you often run into with a lot of bedding plant crops. I see it often in peppers. It is a fairly abundant mineral in soil, so it's often presented in soilless media, so that would be like peat moss, coir, or hydroponics. It's an important nutrient. It's especially important for apical growth, your meristem. If you don't have enough boron, your meristem doesn't grow properly. If it doesn't grow properly, you get deformed growth, right? So your early cell wall and cell division is affected, and you have really weird looking plants. I'll say this, boron deficiencies are often confused with insect damage. So if you see plants where the new growth looks all distorted, you're going to get out your magnifying glass. You're going to look for pests. You may even need a microscope because broad mites, which are very small, have very similar symptoms to boron deficiency. So this is one you need to get a microscope out for to make sure. Copper, rare. It's a very rare nutrient deficiency. I'm going to be honest, I haven't seen it in my life other than trying to recreate it in labs. But the plants become blue-green in color. It's a weird bluish hue as you run out of copper. But, you know, it's non-mobile, so it's going to present where? In the apical meristem, not at the bottom of the plant. Zinc, another one that I don't think you're going to run into, especially in greenhouses, because greenhouses have a lot of galvanized steel, and so rainwater runs over, it gets into the tanks, and it takes zinc from the rain, from the galvanizing in the structure, so there's almost always plenty of zinc. But, you know, it's a non-mobile, so it's going to present as chlorosis and stunting in new growth. As far as roots, we should pay attention to roots. Phosphorus causes stunted roots. Nitrogen, typically if you don't have nitrogen, think about it from a plant perspective. The plant's not very big because it needs more, and it's going to put its energy into roots to find new sources of nitrogen. So look how long the roots are relative to the control. Potassium, you need potassium for cells to expand, so the cells are a little smaller, roots are a little smaller. Iron doesn't look too much different. Another one that's worth putting here, I don't have it, is calcium. Calcium looks a lot like phosphorus. The roots are small and stunted and thick because they have trouble putting out new root tips. This is a picture of some tomato plants grown at the college last spring. This was towards the end of our season, and they had been in the pots for a long time, and they had not been fed much. So let's look at them and see what kind of deficiencies we've got. We're looking at the bottom of the plant, and we see a general chlorosis. I can also see some kind of purpling in the center of the leaves. and maybe even on the tips of the leaf, there's a little bit of necrosis happening. What does this tell us? Well, it tells us a couple of things. First of all, I gave you a big hint when I started by saying they haven't been fed in a while. So if they haven't been fed, that means they're missing everything. So we're looking at nitrogen deficiencies, right? So old leaves are going yellow. We're looking at phosphorus deficiencies because the veins are going purple, right? And we're looking at potassium because there's necrosis at the tips of the leaves. Not that I've colored over them all. You can't see that, but and it's really early stages. These are a couple of slides. I've posted them on this week's folder as well as a key for you, helping you to determine nutrient deficiencies. These are really helpful for you. You might want to be able to use them for your assignment, although I do want you to use proper terminology like chlorosis and necrosis in your nutrient deficiency report. And this is the one for immobile elements.